Right now, you're probably writing something. Maybe it's a text message. Maybe you're signing your name. Maybe you're taking notes. Whatever it is, you're using one of the most important inventions in human history. But writing wasn't invented to tell stories. It wasn't invented to write books. It wasn't invented to preserve history. It was invented because somebody needed to count sheep. To understand how that happened, we have to go back nearly 10,000 years to a small farming village in the ancient Near East. There, long before the first alphabet, long before kings, libraries, or literature, people faced a surprisingly ordinary problem. How do you remember who owns what? If your neighbor borrowed 3 sheep, how would you prove it a month later? If a family stored grain for the winter, how would they know how much was left? When everyone in the village knew everyone else, memory was enough. But villages don't stay small forever. As farming spread, harvests became larger. Herds grew. People began trading with strangers instead of close relatives. And suddenly, memory wasn't reliable anymore. Someone needed a better system. The solution they invented was astonishingly simple. Instead of writing words, they made tiny objects out of clay. Some were shaped like little cones. Others looked like spheres. Some were discs. Others were cylinders or pyramids. Each shape represented something different. A cone might stand for a measure of grain. A sphere could represent a sheep. Another shape might represent a jar of oil. Instead of writing, people counted with symbols they could hold in their hands. Today, they seem almost meaningless, just tiny pieces of baked clay. But archaeologists have uncovered thousands of them across the ancient Near East. For decades, nobody knew what they were. They weren't toys. They weren't jewelry. They weren't decorations. And they didn't seem to have any religious purpose. They appeared almost everywhere, buried beneath houses, inside storage rooms, near temples, scattered across ancient settlements hundreds of miles apart. The mystery lasted for generations. Then, in the 20th century, an archaeologist named Denise Schmandt-Besserat began looking at them differently. Instead of studying one excavation at a time, she compared discoveries from hundreds of archaeological sites across Mesopotamia. Slowly, a pattern emerged. The same shapes appeared again and again, not just in one village, but across an entire region. That couldn't be a coincidence. If communities separated by hundreds of kilometers were making identical clay symbols, they probably weren't creating art. They were following a shared system, and the only thing every settlement had in common was trade. The more she studied them, the clearer the answer became. These weren't random objects. They were accounting tools, the world's first bookkeeping system. Each token represented one specific item: one sheep, one basket of grain, one jar of oil, one bundle of cloth. If you owned 10 sheep, you held 10 tokens. If someone bought 5 jars of oil, they received 5 matching symbols. Simple, reliable, almost impossible to misunderstand. For thousands of years, that was enough. A shepherd could count his flock. A farmer could record his harvest. A merchant could keep track of goods moving between villages. Without realizing it, humanity had invented something entirely new, information that existed outside the human brain. For the first time, memory wasn't trapped inside someone's head. It could be carried in a pouch, passed to another person, stored for months, even years. It was a quiet revolution. But revolutions have a habit of outgrowing the systems that created them. Because around 3,500 BCE, something extraordinary happened. Villages had become cities, and cities create problems that villages never have. More people, more goods, more trade, more things to keep track of. Nowhere was that clearer than Uruk in southern Mesopotamia. It was one of the first true cities on Earth. Thousands of people lived there. Grain poured into massive storehouses. Sheep arrived by the hundreds. Textiles, pottery, oil, beer, everything had to be counted. The little clay tokens that worked so well for small villages suddenly weren't enough. There were simply too many of them, and they created a new problem. How do you prove nobody has changed the count? The solution was surprisingly clever. Instead of carrying loose tokens, merchants sealed them inside hollow clay balls called bulli. If a shipment contained 10 sheep and 5 jars of oil, The matching tokens went inside. The ball was sealed shut. Nobody could tamper with the count without breaking it open. But there was one inconvenience. If you wanted to know what was inside, you had to smash the ball. So someone had an idea. Before sealing it, they pressed each token into the soft clay. Now the outside showed exactly what was inside. And then, someone asked the question that changed history. If the marks on the outside already tell us everything, why keep the tokens at all? The answer was obvious. You don't. The tokens disappeared. The symbols stayed. Instead of pressing little clay objects into the surface, scribes began pressing the symbols themselves onto flat clay tablets. That moment doesn't look dramatic. There was no celebration, no inventor announcing a breakthrough, just one practical improvement after another. But by removing the token, they had accidentally invented writing. The earliest examples appear around 3300 BCE in Uruk. Today we call them proto-cuneiform tablets. And here's the surprising part. They don't tell stories. They don't describe kings. They don't explain how the world was created. Most of them are boring. They're inventories, lists of grain, counts of sheep, worker rations, temple supplies. The very first writing in human history looked less like a novel and more like a spreadsheet. Thousands of years before anyone wrote a poem, someone wrote this many sheep, this much barley, this many workers. Writing wasn't born from imagination. It was born from administration. But writing didn't stay that way for long. Once people realized symbols could represent more than numbers, they started using them for names. A person's name on a burial object meant they could be remembered after death. A name on a temple offering meant it belonged to the gods. According to archaeologist Denise Schmandt-Besserat, this may have been one of the first steps toward writing ideas instead of just counting things. From there, everything accelerated. Within a few centuries, scribes were recording laws, religious rituals, medical treatments, trade agreements, royal decrees, history itself, and eventually, stories. The oldest surviving epic in human history, the Epic of Gilgamesh, was written in the very same script that began as a way to count grain and sheep. The same symbols that once tracked harvests were now asking what it meant to be human. What started as accounting became civilization's memory. But there's another side to this story, one that usually gets left out. The moment writing became reliable, it also became a tool of control. A ruler who could record how much grain each family owed could also record who hadn't paid. A government that could count workers could also decide who would build canals, walls, and temples. When archaeologists study ancient cuneiform archives, they don't just find trade records. They find tax records, labor lists, tribute payments, land ownership, even slave transactions. The same symbols that counted sheep were now organizing entire societies. Writing gave power something it had never really had before. Permanence. A spoken order disappears the moment it's heard. A written order can outlive the person who gave it. It can be copied, stored, enforced years later by someone who wasn't even there when it was written. That's the beginning of bureaucracy, and whether you love it or hate it, you still live inside it today. Birth certificates, passports, school records, bank statements, property deeds, marriage licenses, court rulings, every one of them belongs to the same family tree that began with tiny clay tokens in a farming village thousands of years ago. That's the strange thing about history. The inventions that change the world rarely begin the way we expect. Writing didn't begin with poets trying to preserve beautiful stories. It began with ordinary people trying to solve an ordinary problem. How many sheep do we own? How much grain is left? Who owes what? Everything else came later. So the next time you send a text, sign your name, or write a shopping list, remember that you're using the descendant of an idea that's more than 5,000 years old. An idea that started with a handful of clay tokens, changed into marks pressed into wet clay, and eventually became every book, every law, every message, and every story you've ever read. All because someone, thousands of years ago, needed a better way to count sheep.